Business story now that is really all about tech and everybody that uses social media. Facebook, the tech giant, has finally taken a step long demanded by users, rolling out public detailed guidelines, 27 pages of them, I believe, used to determine whether posts should be removed. And it's all happening, of course, with Facebook under fire after that Cambridge Analytica data breach and facing new regulations. It is also coming just a day before the company's quarterly earnings are announced. With us in New York, Lisa Garber, a cybersecurity and data expert, and here with us in the studio are Asher Westropp-Evans. Asher, before we talk about who this is good for, who this is bad for, what are these new guidelines Facebook is rolling out?
So these guidelines aren't new in the sense of that Facebook hasn't had guidelines before, but it really lays out, as you said, in that 27-page detailed document, some of the nitty-gritty and gory details of the specifics of what the Facebook plan for guidelines is for now. We can take a look at some of the more notable ones that have come out recently. So the credible violent threats or reveling in sexual violence, these are acts that are banned now on Facebook explicitly, promoting terrorism or poaching of endangered species, attempting to buy marijuana, and that one's named specifically, selling firearms directly on the site, and this is an interesting one, committing multiple homicides at different times or locations.
Who knew that had to be said?
One homicide is allowed, to be noted. One homicide may be allowed, but if you've committed multiple homicides, you are no longer welcome on the Facebook platform.
Okay, well, let's bring Lisa into this discussion. And Lisa, what do you make of, first of all, what do you make of some of these regulations, some of them which sound quite absurd, and do you think this is going to actually help Facebook repair its image?
These kinds of community standards, these posting guidelines, are something that every social media platform has to handle, and they have been for years. What's interesting about Facebook's update is that I believe back in 2005, this kind of content, what's acceptable use, acceptable posting, was 1 page long. Now we're in 2018, it is 27 pages long, and you realize the intricacies and the specifics of what people post and how differently it can depend on the context. For example, if somebody's posting a racial slur, or if they're in a derogatory manner, or if they're discussing a personal experience, how do the people that Facebook employs, and they employ thousands of people to go through this kind of content, what kind of background is appropriate, what kind of certification training is appropriate to quickly pull these examples of content and get them down? It's also in an atmosphere where, especially in the US, people are very litigious about Facebook, Twitter, social media platforms being a sort of melting pot for terrorism, for this kind of terrorist propaganda. So at the same time that Facebook is trying to make it a really warm environment for people to spread ideas, they're also trying to balance that between taking down criminal activity.
Lisa, you're referencing the very, very difficult task that Facebook and any real social media has in reining in and trying to decide where a very fine line actually is. It's nice to put those guidelines out in public, but the tough thing is to enforce it. Do you think, I mean, give us a little bit of context on how tough it is for a company to actually enforce it and make those changes going forward?
Part of the problem is how users and the community in general views Facebook or Twitter or Instagram as being judge, jury, and executioner. They're not only picking out the content that they say goes against their user policy, their guidelines, but they're also immediately taking it down, which is one of the reasons that this new update to the Facebook policy is so important, that they're going to allow a review process, which is something that many of the other platforms have allowed for some time, especially Google's YouTube. And I mean, it depends on what kind of experts they have reviewing the content. I think there are a couple of human rights attorneys. There are other kinds of lawyers that are there with different specialties, HR people, and this will be really helpful in determining what happens next, but we really need to see how it plays out.
Lisa, I've been reading some interesting commentary on how some of these new privacy regulations that are being suggested in Washington and elsewhere may actually end up benefiting the biggest web companies, social network companies like Facebook and like Google, to the detriment of some of the smaller ones.
It's interesting, right? Because at first we're thinking with all of this, these news headlines, people trying to really catch Facebook, Google, all of these huge tech giants in all of these privacy webs where they've gone against, you know, we look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal, 87 million users' data just released to the wrong parties. And you'd think, well, that might lessen user activity, user engagement, but actually nobody's really abandoning these platforms, and their stock prices have gone up, and user engagement is still there. And part of that is because they're giants. These companies have been around for a long time. And when you look at the new privacy regulations that are coming in, like the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, which is coming out in about a month, it's very expensive to comply. So the companies that can actually comply with these regulations, which are important, very, very important to user privacy, these are the companies that actually have the funds to do so. So the smaller tech companies, the startups, the ones that are in incubators right now, may not be able to, unfortunately, to use the phrase, pay to play. They may not be able to get to the point where they can actually comply with the GDPR, with other data breach responsibilities, things like that.
Asher, Lisa points to that really important fact that these companies are massive, they have the money, and maybe their stock price isn't even that much affected. We're going to hear more about that tomorrow from Facebook.
Exactly right. The earnings report, the quarterly earnings report for the March quarter, the first quarter of 2018, is expected out tomorrow. And it's going to be interesting to see. This is sort of seen as the first test of Facebook's earnings and capacity to continue on in strength in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. You know, Cambridge Analytica has been shaping the narrative around Facebook for the last 6 weeks. And it's going to be interesting to see if this earnings report overshadows it with strong growth and strong development, which is, of course, what Facebook is hoping for. And it seems likely that they may still get that, given a lot of the big trauma and big issues that happened around the Facebook scandal occurred in April, after the time in which this reporting period includes, meaning that we might actually have to wait until the July report comes out before we actually see the full impact of what happened from this Analytica scandal, which by then the narrative may have moved on completely.
We may have forgotten about it.
And it may be that all this discussion about Facebook and the talk perhaps of some of these new regulations, that's actually going to drive some people now to the site. They may end up benefiting by this.
No publicity is bad publicity, as some would say. Not that Facebook necessarily needs publicity. With 2.2 billion users and a very active and growing user base, it seems likely that, as with past earnings seasons, this one is likely to be a positive step for Facebook. It has been up until now, although there is been some shaky steps with user engagement in the North American market, which is their primary driver of revenue.
But a really important point brought up here in this conversation, both from you and from Lisa, that these companies have been around for a very long time. They have an amount of data that no small company getting its start can hope to have, and that means laying the groundwork for a lot of business to come, whether or not people are angry about data breaches or not, which is probably an unfortunate reality. Asher, Westropp-Evans, and Lisa Garber.